So do you have a degree or do you have experience in accounting, in finance, in human resources? So what is your functional background? So that's also a way to think about diversity. Then we have equity. And so equity is there fairness in the systems that are within society? And so those systems can be within your organizations, they could be within your groups, they could be within the University of Washington, but it assesses the fairness within those systems. So do all groups have equal chance or a chance to get to higher levels of the organization? Or within our society, do all groups, no matter what their demographic background, have the opportunity to achieve the things that most people want, which is access to healthcare? I think all people want that. And access to education, access to income. So that's the questions that equity asks. Then we have inclusion. And so within organizations, we need to be thinking about diversity. We also need to be thinking about equity. And then we also need to be thinking about inclusion. So inclusion is, do we have the ability to express our true identities within these spaces? Do we feel valued for those identities? Do we feel valued as a human being? And so that's what inclusive means. And just to give you some knowledge about this topic is that if we don't feel included, then we're not going to express those identities. If we don't feel psychologically safe, then we're not going to feel safe expressing our ideas within those spaces. So all of these topics are important with us if we care, and we should, about DEI issues within organizations. All right, so when we're asking these types of questions, a diversity question might be, what are the characteristics represented in my particular group? So what is represented and what tends to not be as represented within my group? And then equity might ask, are there structural biases within my system? And are those biases acknowledged and corrected for? So for example, do all individuals have the ability to rise at higher levels within the organization, or only do some groups tend to go at higher levels of organization? And who is attempting to achieve group membership, but they don't have that ability to achieve group membership? Who is trying to get access to these spaces, but they don't have access to these spaces? And inclusion would ask things like, does everyone feel esteemed? Do we feel like we belong? Do we feel like I can express my identity in this space? Or do I need to hide my identities in these spaces? Do we feel acknowledged and respected? And now I'd like to just say, why does diversity matter? Now, first of all, and this should be the only thing that we should have to say on this topic, is that diversity matters because it is a moral right that all individuals, all of our identities, should be able to get access to all the things that people care about within our society. So access to healthcare, access to education, access to good jobs, access to income, access to being treated fairly as human beings. So there's a moral reason why diversity matters. And there are also other reasons that diversity matters. And again, the moral reason could be the only one that we talk about, and sometimes is the only one maybe we should talk about. And I'd also like to acknowledge that literature demonstrates that diversity has a positive relationship with bottom line performance within your company. So if you want your companies to have higher levels of financial performance, then diversity is positively related to bottom line financial performance. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. And diversity is also, if we care about innovation within our organizations, within our groups, then diversity is positively related with learning and creativity and innovation within our groups. All right, so some examples of how diversity is positively related to the financial bottom line of organizations. For each 1% increase in the rate of gender diversity resulted in an approximately 3% increase in sales revenue. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have financial returns above their national industry median. And also companies in the top quartile for ethnic diversity were 35% more likely to have financial returns above the national industry median. So we're seeing these results that, and these are just some of the results, that having increased levels of diversity within our organization leads to positive things in terms of the bottom line for our organization. But things get in the way. And so in order to have those positive effects of diversity, we need to have diversity in our spaces. We need to also have those perceptions of equity, that people are treated fairly within those spaces. And we also need to feel included in those spaces. So we need to feel psychologically safe to share different aspects of our identities within those spaces. But there are some challenges, and I think that most of us are aware of these different challenges. One is social categorization, that we tend to group individuals by their identities and have certain heuristics and assumptions and stereotypes about groups based on their categorical membership. And another is implicit bias. I'm going to be talking about implicit bias today. There's lots of rich literature out there about implicit bias and a lot of things that get in the way of diversity. I think implicit bias is something that we might not be conscious of. And so that is something that I think we bringing awareness to today can be really helpful when we're leading our organizations. So what is implicit bias? It's an unconscious association with a group. It could be positive, it could be negative, but it's mainly unconscious. So we're not aware of our implicit biases. I would encourage us all, and I do so as well, this research was pioneered by Tony Greenwald here at the University of Washington, and also other researchers at Harvard University. And now there is a website that you can go to, and it's been around for a really long time, and you can find out your own implicit biases. So it has a number of groups. It's called Project Implicit, and we can provide that link later on today. And you can go on that website and you could see and test to see if you have an implicit association, either positively or negatively, with certain groups. Now, I want to also acknowledge that we all have these implicit biases. When these tests first came out, I went online, I did a test for the relationship with women and male with career, and I found out that I have a slight to moderate association with male and career. And so what that means is that I had a slight negative association with female and career. And I want to acknowledge that I am a woman and I also have a career. And so it really bothered me that I had this association, negative association towards myself and other women in careers, and that I was doing research on the topic at the time. And so it was really troubling to me. So of course I did the test, and then I did the test again, and then I did the test again. And then I started thinking, the results held, by the way, that I did have this slight negative or slight to moderate negative association with women in career. So I started to think about, where might this be coming from? Why might I have this negative association? And I'll talk about my journey, and I'm happy to say that I no longer have that negative association at this point, which is more consistent absolutely with my own personal beliefs. So where do implicit biases come from? Well, they come from our environment and our culture. So if we think about, what do we see on TV? What do we see in our social media? Where we get information, that is your brain processing information. And so it's learned by our environments. Where are we in our environments? It's also not necessarily your explicit belief. It's not consistent with your own thoughts, or it might not be consistent with your own thoughts about any group. And so it might not be the only truth that you hold. And so that's why I think implicit bias might be particularly insidious, and that we have explicit beliefs, but our unconscious mind might be acting in ways that is inconsistent with our preferences, inconsistent with our values. And it might not be visible to you, so you might not know about it. So let's talk about our unconscious mind. Our mind makes decisions before we know that our mind is making decisions. And as human beings, we get so much information from our environment, so much so that it's really efficient and adaptive for us not to cognitively process all of that information. So if you think about walking down the street, there's millions of pieces of information that's coming to you. It's the sidewalk, the trees, the flowers, maybe other people around, what they look like, where they're acting. So all of this your brain is processing. And so you can't consciously be aware of every single event, how your legs are feeling, how your feet are feeling, how your shoes are feeling. You can't be cognitively aware of everything. And so our unconscious mind takes care of a lot of that information. And our decisions are sometimes made within 1/10 of a second. And we see research that is supportive of this, that sometimes people in interview situations, a decision is made whether or not to hire someone in the first 2 minutes of an interview. And that's before the person has the opportunity to share all their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So sometimes when we let our unconscious mind go, then we are making decisions without knowing that we're making decisions. We've already made this decision and we've moved forward. So the research on this is trying to, how do we make these unconscious decisions more conscious? How do we take these unconscious things that are happening that are likely leading to bias and discrimination that is probably not consistent with our own ideas? How do we slow it down, and how do we make more conscious decisions? All right. So first, I'm going to highlight how implicit bias influences our decisions, and then I'll talk about how do we get rid, or how do we make changes to our implicit biases. So first, we have this implicit bias that we may or may not know about. That leads to expectations and stereotypes about individuals. So we have either positive or negative ideas about individuals based on their group membership. And what our human brain does is that based on those stereotypes and assumptions, we seek out information. It's called the confirmation bias. We seek out information that is consistent with those ideas. So as we're in our environments, we ignore information that is inconsistent with our stereotypes. And instead, we focus on the information that is consistent with our stereotypes. So this is a known bias for human beings. There's been literature on this for over 20 years. We know that human beings do this. And so when we do this, unfortunately, that leads to making it such that, again, we might be ignoring really positive performance if that's not consistent with our stereotype, and instead picking out the different actions that are more consistent with our negative stereotype about that group and that group membership. So you can see how this can be particularly insidious and harmful. What does that lead to? It leads to different opportunities. So different opportunities to get to higher levels of the organization, different opportunities for training, different opportunities for all the things that people care about in their work. It leads to more negative evaluations. So if you're only thinking about the negatives associated with this person based on your stereotype about their group, then you're more likely to have negative evaluations of that person. Now, the flip side could also work. So you might have more positive expectations or a positive implicit bias towards people in this group, and that will lead to more positive evaluations. But the research and the issue tends to be more on the negative. So because negative information tends to be more powerful in our brains and have more influence, the negative bias we have towards others can be particularly insidious and harmful. It also leads to more opportunities for influence for those individuals that we have a positive bias towards, and lower opportunities for influence and we might not even ask individuals' opinions or listen to their opinions if we have a negative bias towards individuals from that group. Okay. Oh, thank you, Tiana, for putting the project implicit in the chat. Thank you so much. All right, so what are some consequences of this? I think that you can already see there's some pretty negative consequences. And those consequences can be in the medical field to where you don't get the adequate medical treatment. You don't get access to pain medicine that you need. You don't get proper diagnosing. In the world, I was just at a conference yesterday. We hosted a conference on people who are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion research in the accounting and finance literature. And we saw a number of studies showing that people of color have less access to loans if they're entrepreneurs than people who are white. And so less access to financial opportunities, or they get higher interest rates than people who are white. So financial, medical, also employment opportunities, less ability or less not being hired is one. If you are hired, you will have lower evaluations or could have lower evaluations. So less recruitment, less selection. Also, in terms of social networks, we know that having access to information can sometimes not be equal, that mentoring and support is really, really helpful. And so getting access to that information tends to be restricted based on who you know and also who tends to look like you. And so if at higher levels of the organization, we have people with certain demographics and you don't share those demographics, you might not receive the same mentoring and support. I want to share an example of a company that I worked with that they had a test. And there'd been a lot of research done on this test to ensure that the test was not biased. And so, yeah, the test was not biased. The first year the test rolled out, and this was a test to get to a higher level. So from lower levels, you had to pass this test or get higher levels on this test in order to advance in the ranks. And so individuals took this test the first year, and there didn't look to be bias on the test. So the test wasn't biased. But in future years, we started to see that people who were women and people of color were less likely to do well on the test than people who were male and white. And so we did interviews in order to find out, why is this happening? And it happened, and we made some corrections based on this, because individuals who were white and male tend to be more likely to take the test because there were more white and male individuals within this organization, and then created test materials that they would give to other individuals. And those other individuals who were going to be taking the test tended to look like them. So they were sharing information with others, not thinking I'm only going to share this information with certain individuals from certain groups, but that's how it, because of implicit bias, how it tended to break down, is that women and people of color had to develop their own test materials, whereas the people who got access to other test materials from future years, and if you can think about it, those materials would build, wouldn't they? Additional information would be added to those test materials. And so women and people of color had less access to those test materials. And that's why women and people of color tend to do not as good on those tests. And so the answer to that is to give everyone access to these test materials. And that way we can all have, again, a chance to do well on that test and get to higher levels of that organization. And that mentoring and support is so important. And again, we tend to mentor individuals who look like us. Then influence and power. In decision-making, people who tend to look like the leader, or people who tend to look demographically similar to who we conceive as leaders, tend to be listened to and heard more. All right, so this is the pretty negative consequences of implicit bias. Now let's talk about some good news, right? Let's talk about some good news. Now there's been research that has been conducted that how do we actively change our implicit biases? And so this was my journey of changing my implicit bias. And it turns out awareness is not enough. It's not enough to know we have an implicit bias. We have to actively do something in order to change this implicit bias. And so this is research that was done. Researchers had individuals do all of these things, and then their implicit bias changed. So first, I'll go through each of them. The first one is stereotype replacement. So this is just acknowledging that stereotype that for me, that women are less successful in careers, which I don't cognitively agree with. I replaced it with my gender identity does not predict performance in career, that women and men and non-binary and all the various gender identities can be successful within careers. So actively replacing the negative stereotype with a positive stereotype or the correct stereotype. Counter stereotypical imaging. So all my career, I had been in business schools, and business schools tend to not have women at higher levels. Now they do, which is fantastic. But when I was a doctoral student and when I was in my career early on, when I first did this test, I didn't see a lot of examples of successful women at higher levels of leadership. And so what I did was I went to other colleges, because in psychology and social psychology and sociology, there were fabulous, amazing women who were leaders. We also had a provost who was an amazing woman leader. So I looked at other examples of women who were leaders, and those were my counter stereotypes. So I found and actively found counter stereotypes to go counter to that negative stereotype. I found those really successful women. The next strategy is individualization. And this is, I think, really powerful. It's the opposite of dehumanization. So dehumanization is removing all humanity from a person and making them less of a human being. Individualization is acknowledging that this is a person, that we are people, that we have goals, that we have wishes, that we have dreams, like people who care about them. So individualization is looking at individuals as individuals with hopes and wishes and dreams, just like everyone has. So that's individualization. I think that this is a pretty powerful tool as leaders when we're going to give feedback, when we're doing our evaluations, when we're about to have a conversation that might be difficult, then taking some time and engaging in individualization can be really helpful. The next strategy is perspective taking. Perspective taking, I have mixed feelings about this. Now, first of all, it's research-based. There's a lot of research that shows that perspective taking is incredibly helpful as a leader, that if we spend 10 to 15 minutes actively thinking about what it is to be in another person's shoes, that perspective taking can make us a better leader. We're more likely to listen. We're less likely to discriminate. So perspective taking is really good for us. What I don't like about perspective taking is that we cannot possibly know what it's like to be in another person's shoes. And so I think what perspective taking is doing is taking us out of our selfish mode and putting ourselves in we can see others in the world mode. So I would encourage you to do perspective taking, but I'm interested in additional research on this topic to maybe replacing perspective taking with empathy or something else that doesn't have us making assumptions of what it is to be another person, because I don't think we have the capability of knowing what it's like to be another person, especially another person with different identities from our own. The next is increase opportunities for contact. So who are we interacting with? Who are the people we're interacting with right now? What does our social media feed look like? What are the types of TV shows that we're watching? So really, where is our community? What is the diversity of our community that we're in now? And actively disrupting that such that we are now engaging more with people that we have that negative implicit association with. So we're going to increase opportunities for contact. Okay, so that's at the individual level. Now I'm going to talk about the group level. So at the individual level, that's our individual work. And I have to acknowledge that while I'm happy that I no longer have that implicit association, I have work to do. I know for a fact that I'm going to keep on working, and I'm not where I want to be right now. And it's going to be continuous work for me. And it's kind of wonderful work too, because it's work that I know that's going to make me a better citizen, that's going to make me a better mom, that's going to make me a better professor, that's going to make me a better colleague. So this work is not ever done for me. And it's not ever done for organizations or a group either. So what can we do at the group level? The first is to structure for success. Now, I've done some early research in this field, and what we did was we manipulated the names of people on their resume. We had the same resume, but we just changed the names. And we showed that people were less likely to hire a woman compared to a male, again, with the same resume, or a person of color versus a white person, again, with the same resume. And since I've done that work and others have done that work, that's been replicated again and again and again. So what can we do about it as a group when we're selecting people in? One thing we could do is remove all information that is not relevant. So what is information that is not relevant? One thing is the names. Like when we're reviewing applicants, to first decide whether or not we're going to interview individuals, focus on those knowledge, skills, and abilities. The knowledge, skills, and abilities that are really important for this particular task. And so that's what I encourage you to do, is hone in, find out have that conversation before, find out what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed. And then with laser focus, hone in on those and ignore or remove all of the other information. I want to say that this research has also, not done by me, but by others, has shown that even your zip code there can be discrimination against zip codes, against socioeconomic status, against a variety of other things that might indicate race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. So we want to be really laser focused on what the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we want when we are hiring, and remove all other information. I will say that in my own research, when leaders said to people making decisions, focus on these specific criteria, then discrimination was removed. So the effect of the different names did not have an impact anymore. So this laser focus can really help us in our groups remove discrimination and bias. We can also look outside our groups. Where we recruit from tends to be the same types of places, and those places tend to have the same types of demographics. And so we need to really disrupt where we're recruiting from. One thing that organizations sometimes do is have a refer a friend, and those can be a good thing, but also a negative thing, because if we continue to hire from the same people or from the same places, we'll tend to have people who tend to look the same. And so the refer a friend is probably not a good idea if we want to enhance our diversity within our organizations. The other thing I want to note is that if a degree is not needed for the job to be done, and I know I'm talking to people at the University of Washington, but if a degree is not needed, then I would encourage us to remove a degree requirement from the position, because unfortunately within our society, there's a lot of discrimination against socioeconomic status, and people of color and other groups tend to not have as much access to educational opportunities. And so you might be limiting the diversity within your applicant pool. And actually, I know you're limiting the diversity in your applicant pool if you have a degree be a requirement. There's also research that shows that we tend to really care about the prestige of the university when university is important. But that research shows that if the degree is important, then the prestige of the university does not predict performance. So, and you would see that based on our identity membership, some groups are more likely to be at high prestigious universities. And we're limiting our diversity if we focus on prestigious universities. Instead, again, the research shows that it doesn't matter. And so hire from any university. You have a question, Christian? I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Okay, I just unmuted. Hi, thank you. Just real quick on that note, I would ask, in your experience and professional opinion on this topic, when a job description, you generally at the very bottom, list a preference of background, including a master's degree, and then within, X area of study or focus. But the job in and of itself does not require a master's degree or higher education in terms of its requirements via HR, nor is the position valued or stated as such that it would have any growth, even if you did have that preferred master's degree requirement, or not requirement, non-requirement, sorry, non-requirement.
So there's some evidence that suggests that based on your group membership, you're either more or less likely to apply when you have all of the features of the job versus less of the features of the job. So there's some evidence to suggest that women are less likely to apply to jobs that they don't completely fulfill those requirements or suggestions. So less likely to apply. And I would think that probably generalizes to other groups as well. I don't know for a fact if that generalizes to other groups, but I would suggest that it probably does. So suggesting a preference for something, I would also remove. If there's a reason for that preference, like there's some specific knowledge, skill, and ability that might come from having a master's, then you can list that, whatever that is. Does that make sense?
Very much so.
Okay.
Yes, I agree with everything that we're discussing right now.
Okay. All right, cool. So you see here, there's a number of ways that we can limit our applicant pool. And one is where we go to advertise and try to get applicants. And another is, what do our ads look like? Do they look like they are friendly to all sorts of people, to the diversity of people? I think the University of Washington does a good job of putting statements that we are an employer that values diversity. So I think we're good in that realm. Some of the organizations that I work with aren't as good in that realm, so I'm glad about that. But sometimes I do think that we list requirements that aren't requirements, or we list preferences that actually aren't preferences. And so really honing in what is the type of performance that we need to be focusing on here can help remove the effect of implicit bias of people opting in, also applicants opting in, or those opting out. And whenever we have a situation where, based on our demographic membership, we have a higher chance of people opting out, we want to try to remove that opting out, if that makes sense. So if we have individuals look at the ad, and some individuals, maybe women, people of color, maybe lower socioeconomic status, are less likely to apply for our jobs, then we need to remove that information such that people are more likely to apply for those jobs, regardless of their demographic background. Now, I do want to acknowledge that if we have, for example, I had some dental surgery yesterday. I do want a dentist that is trained and to do that dental surgery. All right, so those are very specific knowledge, skills, and abilities that I want that person to have. And likely that's via a university. So when it's, again, related to performance, we need to hone in and focus on that performance. And I'm definitely not against people getting a degree from the University of Washington or any other college or university. And we need to make sure that if that's a requirement, that we focus in on the very specific type of performance that we're looking for. Okay, every time I say that, I worry my dean is going to call me at some point and have me in his office. No, my dean is very supportive. So, and the next thing that I encourage organizations and groups to focus on is accountability. So the first thing is just question your own first impressions and question your group's first impressions too. I want to notice that sometimes the same people are also questioning. So make it just part of your procedure to do that questioning. So put it in your procedure. We have procedures can save us from our implicit bias. Procedures can be fabulous for us. They can help us remove a lot of that implicit bias. So having a procedure that really has us dig in onto the knowledge, skills, and abilities that the applicant express. So have behavioral-based interviews. I know that many of you are HR professionals. You know that we're supposed to do behavioral-based interviews, semi-structured interviews as well, asking the same questions to every participant or applicant. But we need to question those first impressions. And we also need to seek out objective data. When I work with organizations, I go in and I ask them, have you run your data? Do you look at if pay is significantly predicted by gender identity? And if it is, then something's going on. I want to say that probably within most places, pay is significantly predicted by our gender identities and our race and our ethnic identities, and maybe by other identities as well. And I would just encourage you, anytime you are making a decision about whether or not someone can be promoted, whether or not people are given raises, that you run those outcomes by identities to see if the gender identity or the racial identity predicts raises. And so oftentimes this is going to happen in your organization. So before you give the raises, my advice to you is see if gender predicts it. If you need help running these analyses, I'm happy to help you. They're pretty quick. I've done them a lot. And you just run a simple regression. If it does predict, then you go back. Before you give out those raises, you go back, you look at what is your criteria again, because you don't want men or women, so you don't want your raises to be predicted by gender identity. So it could be that there's bias in the system if that happens. So be looking at your pay, looking at your raises, looking at who gets training opportunities, all the outcomes that matter for your organization, for your group. Look at them by those gender identities. Also seek out feedback. So we need to seek out feedback from people who are leaving our organizations, and seek it out in a safe way, and in a way maybe by a third party. So it's safer. Also, you might seek out feedback from people who decided not to take the job at your group or organization. So where there's subtle hints that people felt like they weren't welcome. And so having a safe way for people who opt out to share that information of why they decided to not take those jobs or decided to leave. If you're not hearing anything, then that's a problem. So probably something is going on within your organizations. If people aren't coming and sharing with you negative feedback, then likely you haven't created a space where people feel comfortable sharing that negative feedback. And again, that's all developmental feedback. That's all feedback that's good for us to learn and grow. I see that I have a chat message, but it was direct to me. Okay, the question was, everything you're talking about, I've witnessed and experienced. I'm curious to hear the latest research on how implicit bias plays into organizational 360s. For instance, UW IT is considering, but not yet decided, it's early, but not yet decided, if 360s should be a part of our annual evaluations. Any insights? Okay, so our evaluations, there's lots of evidence to show that evaluations can be biased. How do we reduce bias in our evaluations? Really good question. And that's a 360 evaluation as well as any other type of evaluation. 360s can be important and helpful, but your employees, if they don't feel safe, these are people who you are a leader of. If they don't feel safe sharing that information, you're not going to get good information from that 360. So the first step is really to get people to feel psychologically safe, people who you are leading, for them to feel psychologically safe to share information with you. That's the first step. You can do a 360 and hear you're glorious and wonderful and not know if you're glorious and wonderful, if that's true, or if people just don't feel safe revealing information that is developmentally helpful to you. So finding either a safe way to do those, and usually the N, or the number of people you manage, is so low that people feel like they'll be identified anyway. And so people just don't feel safe sharing that developmental feedback with you. A 360 is not going to put a salve on that wound. Instead, creating a psychologically safe place where people feel like they can share information with you, that's going to be helpful. Now, evaluations. How do we reduce bias in evaluations? One really great strategy is creating behavioral anchors for all of the questions. So instead of saying, is this person good to bad, or on a scale of 1 to 5, excellent is 5, and needs improvement is 1, put exactly the type of behavior that you're looking for. So if 5 is like creative performance, let's say we're evaluating creative performance, 5 would be generated multiple novel ideas and communicated those ideas in an effective way to our group. So that being very specific about the behavior that you would expect if someone was going to get a 5. So instead of just putting, excellent to not so good, let's put exactly the behavior that we're looking for. So that's going to really reduce bias. There's some evidence also that having a 1 to 4 scale is going to be better than a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 7 scale. And that's because people tend on a 1 to 5 to kind of get away from the extremes and have a tendency towards the middle. So this research is not as established as there's some research to show this. So I want to see it be more established before I start changing all of my scales. The behavioral anchoring is solid. Everybody should be using behavioral anchors because we know that that reduces research. Having a 1 to 4 scale, again, the research is showing that this is the case right now. And it doesn't hurt us to have a 1 to 4 scale. So I think that that's an easy change for us to make. And again, there is a lot of research to show that people tend to avoid those 1s and 5s, and the 1 to 4 tends to make it such that that's less likely. So those are some things that I would encourage you to do in any type of evaluation, including a 360. And the next thing that I want us to be thinking about is what are our subtle messages within our environments? So what are we seeing when we walk in? If we see that pictures of all the previous deans or all the previous presidents and all those pictures are white and male, then how does that feel to people who don't share those identities walking into those spaces? So what tends to be celebrated in our organizations? What do we see? What do we feel when we walk in? Do we have multicultural paintings? Do we have paintings that tend to reflect one identity? So what do we tend to see when we walk in? What are projects called when we're calling projects names? So unfortunately, sometimes we can call projects unfriendly names. What is our body language towards others? So there's research that shows if we don't share another person's identity, then we tend to be more back versus front. So we tend to lean in and listen closer on people who share identity versus not. We also tend to sit next to people who make us feel comfortable, who share our identities. And so actively disrupting those interactions can be really helpful. Go to coffee with someone you've not gone to coffee with, or invite people to coffee that you've never invited to coffee with. So try to sit next to people that you often don't sit next to, because those opportunities are opportunities for mentor. This is especially important for leaders, by the way, because as leaders, we tend to interact with other individuals who share our same demographic traits or something similar, some similar identity. And we need to be actively disrupting that so that everyone has those mentorship opportunities. Everyone gets the opportunity to talk to us. If we're restricting that and only talking to people who share our identities, we are not getting all the information of what's happening in our organizations. And we're also not getting the opportunity to mentor others who really need that mentoring and probably would do great with that mentoring. We're just not hearing the truth. So we need to be breaking out, actively disrupting those clicks that we tend to have and are natural, by the way, and we need to be actively disrupting them, especially if you're a leader. And what kind of phrases are we using? Are we using the term guys? Are we using, so a few weeks ago, my daughter and I were playing 20 questions, and I had a very proud mommy moment. I have lots of proud mommy moments, but this was an especially proud mommy moment. So she is 9, and she shared, we're doing 20 questions, and I asked if it was plant, animal, person, or man-made. And she said, Mommy, no, it's human-made. And I just, oh, my heart just, and even talking about it, I get chills. So yeah, I was using the wrong word. That is not the right word to use. I need to be saying human made. So in language, again, language is something that's socially constructed, and some of it is just not friendly. And we need to be actively making changes for ourselves to that language to help others feel welcome. let's see if I have a, okay, yes. Yeah, so you could use y'all. It's natural to me to say y'all, but use a phrase that makes sense to you. Okay, so Emily, I have to admit, I'm going to disclose my identity. I am from Texas. So yes, it might disclose that I'm from Texas. Okay, I know, it's funny. All right, so I shared a lot of information with you, and now is your moment to get in. Okay, so I see some questions that I need to ask. So I'm going to ask your questions, and then I want you to have the opportunity to talk to one another or reflect on your own. So let me answer some of these questions to the extent that I can. I know that there's a huge amount of knowledge in this room. So if you have some answers, put them in the chat too. So I want to try for us all to have the opportunity to learn from one another, because I know that you have a lot of knowledge. A lot of this has been about the application process, but how can you open your hiring process to make it easier for neurodivergent folks to engage? Such a good question. And so there's a couple of things that I've been thinking about. I used to think early in my career that to have people participate, that we needed to have group meetings in a very traditional way, and people need to verbally participate in a very like heteronormative, just normal, that we would voice our opinions like I'm voicing to you now. And what I've recognized is that is just not normal, because what is normal, by the way, there is no normal. What we should be doing is allowing people to share their views and perspectives and opinions in a variety of ways, however they feel comfortable, not what society tells us we should be sharing opinions. So how do we share opinions? By the way, it's also ways that research shows is a really good way to share opinions, which is before we have a meeting, we need to have individuals share their viewpoints on a document that's anonymous, where people can share their viewpoints. And then, because individuals, they brainstorm ideas a lot better. So having individuals brainstorm alone is going to be better than having a group brainstorming in a group. So we want to brainstorm alone and have it in an anonymous way, so we don't pay more attention to some individuals versus other ideas. Then as a group, we come together and make decisions. So this is I've seen this strategy be much more comfortable for individuals who are neurodivergent, but I also want to acknowledge that neurodivergence is in itself divergent. So people have a lot of different, neurodivergence doesn't look one way. And so the more we can incorporate in our ads and in our recruitment, that we have spaces where you can express yourself the way that you feel comfortable expressing yourself, the better applicants we're going to get. Because we don't need to express ourselves in one way, and some of us can't and aren't comfortable expressing ourselves in just one way. We need to have a variety of ways for people to express themselves. Also, the extent to which we can make our work more friendly to a variety of different identities. So if we have the option for online at part of the days, or if we have the option for work from home for some of the days, that's going to be more successful for caregivers. That's going to be more attractive to people who have to drive a long way to get in. So if you check these boxes, it's going to help people who are neurodivergent, caregivers, people who live far away. So you're going to make your ad look more attractive to lots of people. So please do we have some stuff in the chat? I need your help. Awesome. We have a great article in the chat about ways. Thank you, Lauren. And then we have another affinity group that we can reference. Thank you, Allison. Really appreciate that. So, and there is research going on right now. I'm actually starting to conduct some of that research about work from home and neurodivergence, that working from home tends to be, and again, neurodivergence looks a variety of different ways, but it tends to be a way for individuals who are neurodivergent to feel more comfortable in expressing ideas and then being in the workplace sometimes. So that might be one thing, but I love that we have a variety of different ways that people are putting in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay. I love that there's a neurodiverse affinity group on campus. All right, so one of the challenges in our DEI group at UW faces is that we find some mid-managers who are not interested in DEI concerns. How can we entice them to take interest? I hasten to add that this is true even in my unit, where the director and main administrator are fully supportive of DEI goals. Yes, and I would say that there's variance on whether or not people are supportive of DEI goals, and we see that across organizations. So how do we get individuals to lean in and be more interested in this topic? I think that sometimes people think that they are less interested in these topics because they might perceive that exclusionary, which is really the opposite of what DEI topics are. One thing that could be really helpful for me as I come in as a consultant or a researcher, and I just talk about the research. So one thing that you could do is talk about some research. Feel free to use these slides about how if we increase inclusion, people feel psychologically safe. They're more likely to express their innovative ideas, which makes it also more likely that the organization is going to be productive. So sometimes I use research. I use research in order to help convince others that this is going to be beneficial. And there's a couple of articles, and I know that our group here probably has some articles to help provide support on this topic as well. I tend to rely on research. What do you tend to do when you are trying to convince others that DEI is important?
Thank you, Dr. Umphress. This is fantastic. I know that you said you wanted to do some breakout rooms. I just want to give us a little time check. We have 10 minutes. So I think it'd be great to maybe do those now and do like 3 to 5 minutes for people to do some discussion if you'd like to prompt everyone with the question.
Yes, so let me go ahead and stop share. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to put in the chat, or I can share screen what the questions are, but feel free to talk about whatever you'd like. And I'll share this Google Doc to where anyone can see it. Consider the following questions in the table below. So how can we use our individual strategies? So how do you feel like you can help reduce your bias by using the individual strategies that we talked about, or the group strategies, or talk about any that you want? Let me go ahead and share this with everyone. And I'll put it in the chat, and then we can go to the breakout rooms.
Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for your amazing questions. Continue to throw those into the chat. We are collecting all of them, and we'll make sure that they get answered, even following the forum. But you will be heading into your breakout rooms in groups of 4 or so. So you have about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll bring you back to this main room to wrap up for our session. And you should be able to join those rooms now.
And if you prefer to come back into the main chat to defer, you can do that too.
Great. So we're starting to have people trickle back in. Give me a thumbs up. Did you have a good discussion? Did you wish it was longer? No doubt. Yes. Well, hopefully the discussion doesn't stop today. Hopefully we'll just keep it going and keep on chatting. We still have 36 people, so they're waiting for that to be kicked out, which always is a good sign.
Yeah, that is good. I was just going to say they're still talking to the last minute.
Hi, everyone. I hope that you had a good discussion. Give me a thumbs up. Did you feel like you had a good discussion? Do you wish it was longer? Absolutely. I hope so. And this isn't the end. This is, again, this work keeps going. So I just wanted to quickly summarize for you. I hope you had a good discussion. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out to me via email, or Tiana or Allison. They have my contact information. I'm easy to find. There's only one Elizabeth Umphress at the University of Washington, so you can find me. Just in summary, work to reduce your bias. It's not enough to be aware of it. We also need to work to reduce it. And we talked about those strategies, and also help to reduce the bias in your own unit's decision-making. And again, this work is just continuous. So thank you for your time today, and have a wonderful rest of your day and session.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Umphress.
Thank you so much.
This was fantastic. Everyone, feel free to keep throwing in questions into our Q&A anonymously, and also drop questions into the chat. We do have our next session coming up in just a few minutes with Ujima Sands, who is the VP of Total Talent Management. So she will be coming to speak about achieving an inclusive workplace. So we're super excited to have her speak with us and hear about some updates on DEI regarding BIPOC retention and hiring. So it will be a really engaging and interesting session. But please get up, stretch, walk around, and thank you all so much for your engagement. It's great to have you here.